Hello and welcome everyone to this week's National CyberWatch virtual brown bag lunch talk. Thank you for taking the time for this talk today. Now, as you might have noticed, all participants are muted when they enter the conference. So if you hover over your name in the participant list, you'll find a button to unmute yourself. But I request that you keep it on mute for the duration of the talk and only unmute it if you have a question. In the interest of time, we will reserve the questions towards the end. But if you have any questions as I'm speaking, feel free to put that in the chat window. This talk is being recorded so that it can be shared with folks who could not join us at this time. So please consider that as well. So without further delay, my name is Robin Gandhi. I'm an associate professor of cybersecurity at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And I'll be the primary presenter for this talk. David Toby is my co-investigator on this work, and he will not be presenting, but he will be responsible for all the tough questions at the end. And I'll take the easy ones. So today I'll be discussing the design considerations for assessments in a competency-based education program. Now, this work is the result of really a multi-year research collaboration between David and I to diagnose how students misunderstand or misconceive a given concept of interest. Now, that may sound very easy or straightforward at first, but there's certainly more here than meets the eye. So in the next 20 minutes or so, my goal is to discuss the aspects necessary to demonstrate competency and to carve out the role of assessments to do so. I will also show ways to classify faults in understanding of a learner, using a combination of their selected answer responses and their confidence in those responses. Then I'll discuss ways in which learning assurance can be increased by eliminating faulty learner beliefs through a systematic assessment item design process. And finally, I'll briefly discuss ways in which the assessments can be administered to produce useful results. Now, first, let's start with the definition of competency. So competency, which is different from competence, is defined as a combination or bundle of knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to perform a specific task in a given context. Now, from this definition, it should be no surprise that a competency is typically identified using task analysis for carrying out certain areas of responsibility in a job function. Now, also, since different people may develop competency at different rates, the delivery of instruction in a competency-based course needs to be self-paced. It also needs to be accessible as many times as needed till the learner is comfortable in those tasks that needed to be performed. So naturally, competency-based education programs are a great fit for personalized learning. In this type of a model, curriculum delivery is based on assessed readiness for instruction from a learner perspective. So imagine a learning pathway similar to a game with several levels. These levels or gates only unlock when a competency at a certain level is demonstrated. So in a learning pathway, the demonstrated mastery unlocks these gates along a learning path when established thresholds such as 95% of score are reached. So essentially, these gates represent learning thresholds necessary to acquire a transformative way of thinking that is absolutely necessary to move any further on the learning pathway. Now, these learning thresholds are crossed by demonstrating either an understanding of a concept or by performing actions or by making certain judgments based on conditions present in a specific domain. So if we now think about demonstration of mastery in a given domain, which is typically characterized by a collection of tasks, then it requires demonstration of proficiency, competence, and eventually mastery. Let's discuss how we define these concepts. So we define proficiency as the complete understanding of the associated concepts, procedures, conditions, and situations related to a task. I will talk about each of these knowledge topics in the next few slides. The transfer of knowledge to consistent success in a practice lab environment demonstrates competence. We can also call this skilled execution capability. Finally, the transfer of skilled execution across a set of increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous challenge labs demonstrates mastery. So as we can see here, demonstration of proficiency is really prerequisite to everything else. So let's peel that onion first. Now, proficiency in performing a task is achieved when a learner demonstrates 4 levels of knowledge. The first most basic knowledge type is declarative knowledge. This type of knowledge requires knowing that what something means related to performing a task. For example, in a task related to network scanning, it is necessary to know what these concepts, IP address, port 80, or network types mean. Next, procedural knowledge builds upon declarative knowledge by knowing how declarative knowledge is sequenced for performing a task. So here, for example, knowing the sequence of steps to configure a network scanner would be needed for a network scanning task. Next, conditional knowledge requires knowing when a branch in procedures should be executed for performing a task. So in our running example, it would require knowing when the different scanning modes of a network scanner should be used for a network scanning task. Finally, situational knowledge requires knowing where conditionals exist in a given situation for performing a task. As an example, given information on environmental factors and reconnaissance for a given network, knowing to select the most appropriate scanning mode, such as noisy or stealth mode, is needed for this task. So complete understanding of these 4 levels of knowledge is necessary to demonstrate proficiency in a given task. From the figure, we can also see that these different knowledge levels build on each other, starting with the most fundamental declarative knowledge. Now, while demonstration of mastery is the ultimate goal for the learner and for the educator, the role of formative assessments is to help a learner achieve that goal. So its purpose is best served if formative assessments provide a diagnosis of why proficiency is elusive for that learner. Thus, the assessment needs to provide not just a right or wrong result, but help diagnose why the learner got it wrong. To do this, each wrong answer option or distractor should be designed to diagnose faults in understanding. So from an assessment design perspective, good wrong answers require a lot of effort to develop and validate. With such wrong answer options, proficiency now starts to mean picking the right answer with high confidence in the presence of other compelling distractors. This is a much more refined way to understand the word proficiency. To develop such formative assessment instruments, our assessment design is based on a concept inventory format. Concept inventories in educational research are psychometrically valid diagnostic assessment instruments. To produce an accurate diagnosis of faulty understanding, we require a multiple choice question with a 2-level response format, which means that the answer options are actually expanded with different confidence levels in those answers. So let's look at an example. So using this question, we can start to see what this assessment would look like. So to assess the concept of color mixing, the question asks which color results by mixing red and green. Students are given a limited time to answer the question, and they have to pick an answer and express their level of confidence in the chosen answer. We also provide an option to express lack of knowledge to prevent a forced choice situation. So in this case, since we know the answer is yellow and we're highly confident, we would pick the option B with high confidence, very confident. Now, how does this help us? So student responses from the previous question are then classified using a decision matrix. The matrix classifies the student responses based on correctness and confidence dimensions. If the student believes the selected answer is correct with a high confidence, then the selection is correct and with high confidence, and the selection is actually incorrect, then the student demonstrates a very persistent fault in their understanding, and this is what is called the misconception. It is persistent because simply given more instruction may not address this fault due to the learner's high confidence in the wrong understanding. Now, if the learner exhibits low confidence in a wrong answer, then it is simply a misunderstanding. In this case, we could just give additional instruction and possibly remedy the situation. Low confidence in the correct answer could be a lucky guess, which could also be subject to additional instruction. Finally, a high confidence in the correct answer demonstrates proficiency in the assessed knowledge level. Now, this sort of analysis is only meaningful if the wrong answer options are really good distractors. What do we mean by that? So for each tested concept, we should systematically elicit what faulty beliefs could lead to them. This process is called eliminative induction. What we want to show is if the learner does not exhibit the most common faulty understanding, then we have a higher assurance that they have learned correctly. So to develop an assessment item, we have developed a 5-step design process. Step 1 is to start with a noun phrase that best describes the concept to be understood. For example, let's start with another running example here. For learning the administrative command, which adds a user account in Linux. Step 2, place the noun in a question stem. Now take care not to introduce additional concepts in the question when doing this. For example, which command is best used to administratively add a user account in Linux? It's a very straightforward question. Now, step 3, determine the correct answer. I suggest you double check it. In our running example, add user is the expected answer because this command adds all the necessary information about a user account at the time of account creation. Step 4, this is a very important step. Determine what student beliefs can interfere with the learning of the selected concept. So first, we have to state the learning claim very clearly. Such a claim should always start with the phrase, the student correctly understands, followed by the noun phrase that we're interested in, which is administrative command for adding user accounts in Linux. Once the claim is clearly stated, we now attack this learning claim using rebuttals that introduce doubts in this top-level claim. Rebuttals start with the phrase, unless the student believes. So we are looking for alternative beliefs that leads a student to select a distractor. So this phrase, unless the student believes, is followed by the faulty belief. In this case, user add. which only sets the username and does not offer any other account options. So now we continue to add more rebuttals here, such as unless the student believes user mod does it, which only modifies the specified user account instead of adding it. And unless the student believes net user does it, which is a valid way in a Windows command line to add a user account, but not in Linux. So this could be a common way in which these mistakes could be made. In the last step, we include all the rebuttals that we came up with as distractors in the final question form. An additional option is also added to express lack of knowledge. So the final question from a running option looks like this. And then the user selects an answer with the corresponding confidence level in their response. Now, while micro-level diagnosis becomes possible with such an assessment question, a collection of such questions would be needed to demonstrate proficiency in a given domain, such as administrative commands in Linux. Here, we can set appropriate score thresholds to determine if the learner can progress to other advanced topics. Now, such instruments can also be administered as pre and post assessments so that we can effectively evaluate the educational materials that we introduce to address those learning objectives. It may also help diagnose why faulty understanding occurs. And perhaps those educational materials could be modified to address those misconceptions. Now, detailed analysis can also identify a set of questions that can predict student performance on the assessment. So a small set of questions that become really important to know whether a student would do better on the overall assessment. Now, such concepts would be good candidates for threshold concepts or gates that represent a transformative way of thinking so that the learner can advance to more important topics or interesting topics in the field. Now, as you can see, the development of assessment is quite a lot of rigorous design work. In particular, doubts for assessment items are hard to come up with. I completely agree with that. But luckily, this aspect can be crowdsourced. So once the initial set of distractors are identified, we can also open up the assessment to a large group of students, and that can also help us identify good and bad distractors. It doesn't have to be all based on expert knowledge. We can also identify questions that are best predictors of readiness for students to be prepared to take advanced education. The set of distractors can also be elicited and validated in a curriculum design panel like the one we have for the Foundations of Information Security course. Using this philosophy, we have designed a readiness assessment for the Fundamentals of Information Security course that the current panel is producing. So we hope that you will actually take this assessment and provide us with valuable data. All the data collected is anonymous, and the assessment has roughly about 60 questions with 60 seconds available to answer each question. Now, you don't have to take all of those 60 seconds, so you can be done in about 30 minutes or so. We also want to make sure that because of the time limit, we want to make sure that the answer you provide just reflects your base level understanding and confidence in the concept without actually looking up additional information. So I encourage you to follow this link and take the test. It doesn't take a lot of time, and you would be helping us further this research. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I see that I'm right within my time limit, and we will now open for discussion. I also see that there are some questions in the group chat, which I will start to address. But I'll remind you that you can unmute yourself to ask a question that everybody can hear by hovering over your name in the participant list. So I see a few questions being asked already. Casey says, how do you see the results of this assessment being used by an instructor to improve student learning? Does the assessment provide any guidance for a student if it finds the student is not ready for the information security fundamentals course? Great question, Casey. So once the assessment is taken, towards the end, the student receives immediate feedback. We have divided the various assessment questions into certain topics. And the student can immediately view their performance in each one of those topics. Now, ideally, such an assessment could be linked to additional materials or videos or self-paced modules so that the learner can actually prepare for those concepts before starting the information security fundamentals course. So that's really the goal here. Is that we want to make sure that the student is fully prepared to engage in the more advanced security-related topics discussed in the Information Security Fundamental course. Let's take the next question, also from Casey here. Even if a student is found not to be ready for a course, then they may have to be registered to complete their program of study. What should we do in this situation? How can I provide this assessment to my students, and what information will I receive in return? Now, I'd request David to jump in here a little bit to help me with this question. As what we can do is we can provide a detailed assessment and breakdown of student performance to the instructors, also demonstrating their readiness for more advanced concepts. So I hope that addresses the...
Yeah, let me jump in there for a second.
Yeah.
So a couple, I think, important issues here. One, competency-based education is a new form of education, and there's still a lot of open questions, such as if you allow a student to work towards mastery, that might take longer for some students than a traditional semester, which might put them out of sync with the next set of sequence of courses. And so the key is to align a set of, as Robin just mentioned, supplemental or differentiated is typically what it's called, learning materials that enable that person to either catch up or to at least be in alignment with the first set of concepts that will be included in their next course. So readiness then becomes very granular in the next sequence in the course or next step in the course sequence. If the readiness assessment is used to determine that individual's conceptual readiness, then they can begin taking the next course while they're continuing to finish up the so-called prerequisite course. So that's one way in which this approach, even though quite remarkably different, quite dramatically different from traditional outcome-based education, can facilitate the development of competency even in a traditional educational program. So that's kind of addressing that first point. In the second point, in terms of how you could provide this, this assessment is being offered as a pilot study also under the National CyberWatch. And if you're interested in being part of that pilot, there is an opportunity to sign up for that through our website and through the, if you're a member of the National CyberWatch, there's a member site as well, where you can simply list yourself as someone who's interested in participating in these pilots. The information you'll receive along with that really depends on how you want to implement it. The program can be implemented with a link to a learning management system so that each student's individual responses, while remaining confidential outside of the system, can still provide you with a detailed report by student. Or if you don't want to embed it sort of within the course in that manner, it can be provided in an anonymous fashion, and then it can be linked to your course number or some other designation you wish to provide that would allow us to give you an aggregate analysis of all your students. But in that instance, we wouldn't be able to give you an individual student access because we wouldn't be collecting PII data.
And going back to the first point that David made, I think this sort of an assessment can also start to indicate if there are any misconceptions that need to be addressed. And those misconceptions would be really hard to remove just by giving more instruction. So perhaps the instructor can also think about doing certain challenge labs or certain practice exams where the student's understanding is challenged, and it forces them to rethink their confidence in what they had learned before. If there are additional questions, feel free to ask them in the chat window or feel free to unmute yourself. And thanks, David. As I said, I'll save all the hard questions for you.
Yeah, and also I noticed that Casey asked if we could put the URL also in the chat so they could just click on it if they wish.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let me do that. So while you're thinking of these of discussion items, I'm going to post the link to the assessment right here.
Yeah, and also while he's doing that, since we do have a few minutes, feel free to jump into that assessment. That way, if you had any specific questions about any individual question or the structure of the assessment, that we could answer those questions while we're here on the phone.
Yeah. And here's a sample question from the assessment. As you can see, it's very similar to the kinds of questions that we saw earlier in the presentation. A question with 4 answer options and then different confidence levels in each one of those answer options. There will also be a timer that continuously counts down. And if you don't answer within the allotted time, then it just automatically moves on to the next question. Thanks, Casey, for taking the exam yesterday. Yeah, as Casey mentioned, it roughly, it takes somewhere between 25 to 35 minutes.
Casey, would you mind sharing just audio-wise? What was your perception of the assessment? What did you kind of gain from going through it? Maybe he's not in a place he could talk.
Okay, if there are no questions, then oh, there we go. Here's another question. That's a good question, Casey. Why does the concept inventory have to focus on student misconceptions? And as I said in my slides, they are meant to be diagnostic instruments. In fact, that's how they got started in the physics education domain. where even though a lot of students were actually passing the typical exams in their courses with A grades and such, when they were when they took the concept inventory, the force concept inventory, they discovered that they had a lot of misconceptions and bugs in their understanding that prevented them from developing a more thorough and advanced learning or understanding of concepts later on in advanced courses. So it's important to weed out these kind of faults in student understanding as before they move on in their academic careers. So certainly the role of concept inventory is entirely to identify such issues in student understanding. Now, traditionally, concept inventories take a long time to be prepared. Typically, they involve speaking with the students themselves to sort of figure out what sort of faulty understanding they typically might have, or based on instructor experience. And even after these questions are developed, they need to be validated whether those distractors are really any good. And do a lot of people have those faulty beliefs? So creating a concept inventory is really a very time consuming and involved process. So what we are also trying to do here is trying to use crowdsourcing and using the power of the curriculum standards panel that we have assembled to quickly come up with interesting questions, interesting distractors, and then validate them through pilot engagements with students, and sort of have a spiral development process. The assessment that you are actually currently examining or taking, it has actually been being derived from existing practice exams. So we are using your responses to identify what are the good distractors in these questions, and how do they affect the level of confidence in those responses that experts may have. So this is also one way in which a lot of existing question banks can be used to identify sort of the hidden nugget, hidden gems within this large pile of questions that really become important predictors for somebody's readiness for future courses. So once the student takes this readiness test, they take the educational modules, and eventually they take a post-assessment test. We can now start to see how their performance on the readiness actually affected their performance after they took the module. So that would produce a lot of interesting insights into student learning behaviors. And as more of you take this test, identifying that small set of good assessment questions might also shorten the amount of time students spend on assessments. So for example, rather than having a test with 60 questions, if we were to able to hone in on a set of 5 questions that really predict the performance of a large set of individuals on the entire test, then instead of administering all 60 questions, we could ask somebody just those 5 questions, and that would give us a good understanding of their potential gaps in knowledge or critical misunderstandings and misconceptions that need to be addressed before moving forward. Okay, I think we're getting close to our 45-minute time. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time today to hear us and coming and joining us for this brown bag. So thank you.